The frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Winter 1942. German soldiers crouch behind collapsed walls, their breath visible in the bitter cold. They've learned not to raise their heads above cover. Not anymore. Somewhere in the rubble, invisible and patient, waits a hunter who's already claimed dozens of their comrades. A man who learned to shoot by tracking wolves through the Ural Mountains. A man the Germans would soon fear more than artillery barrages or tank assaults. His name was Vasily Zaytsev, and this is the story of how a shepherd's grandson from one of the most remote regions of Russia became the Soviet Union's most celebrated sniper and hunted the hunters that Nazi Germany sent to stop him. March 23, 1915, in the village of Yeleninskoye, deep in the Orenburg region near the Ural Mountains, a boy was born into a world where survival meant knowing how to hunt. Vasily Grigorievich Zaytsev entered life in one of the harshest inhabited terrains on Earth. The Urals stretch for 1,500 miles, a natural barrier between European Russia and Siberia, where winter temperatures plunge to 40 degrees below zero, and civilization exists in scattered pockets, separated by vast wilderness. There were no grocery stores in Yeleninskoye, no markets where meat could be purchased. If the Zaytsev family wanted protein on their table, someone had to go into the forest and bring it back. Vasily's grandfather, Andrei Alexeyevich Zaytsev, understood this reality better than anyone. He'd spent his entire life in these mountains, learning their secrets, their dangers, and their bounty. When Vasily was old enough to walk steadily, Andrei began teaching him the ancient skills that separated successful hunters from those who returned empty-handed or didn't return at all. The lessons started simply: how to move through snow without making noise, how to read animal tracks, how to determine wind direction and understand how it would carry your scent, how to remain absolutely still for hours, even when your muscles screamed and your joints ached from the cold. These weren't just useful skills in the Urals. They were the difference between eating and starving. On Vasily's 12th birthday, his grandfather presented him with a single-shot 20-gauge shotgun. The weapon was simple, reliable, and unforgiving. You had one chance, one shell. If you missed, you went home with nothing. If you wounded an animal without killing it, you had to track it through the wilderness, possibly for miles, before you got another opportunity. The first test came soon after. Wolf tracks in the snow, fresh enough that steam still rose from the depressions where warm paws had compressed the frozen crystals. Vasily followed his grandfather's teachings. He studied the tracks, determined the animal's direction, and positioned himself downwind. Then he waited. Minutes became an hour. An hour stretched toward 2. The cold seeped through his clothing, but he didn't move, couldn't move. Movement meant failure. When the wolf finally appeared, Vasily had one heartbeat to make his decision. The animal was moving, not standing still. The range was at the edge of what the shotgun could handle effectively, but the boy had been raised for this moment. He led the target, compensated for the wind, and squeezed the trigger. One shot, one wolf. His grandfather's pride was quiet, but absolute. The boy had done more than kill an animal. He'd proven he possessed the patience, the discipline, and the nerve that marked a true hunter. Vasily continued his education, but the mountains remained his real classroom. Deer, wolves, foxes. Each hunt taught him something new. How to anticipate where an animal would move before it moved. How to become invisible in plain sight. How to silence his mind and trust his instincts. These lessons were practical, necessary for survival in the Urals. They would also prove essential on an entirely different kind of hunting ground, where the prey shot back. By 1930, Vasily had graduated 7 years of school and enrolled in a construction technical school in Magnitogorsk, one of the Soviet Union's new industrial cities. He studied to become a fitter, learned accounting, and seemed destined for an ordinary life in Stalin's rapidly modernizing nation. But the skills his grandfather had taught him never left. He joined the Civil Guard, a voluntary militia, and his natural talent with a rifle made him a champion in local shooting competitions. In 1937, at 22 years old, Vasily joined the Soviet Pacific Fleet. He was assigned as a clerk in the artillery department, handling paperwork in Vladivostok, thousands of miles from the action that would soon consume Europe. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Vasily was filing documents. When the Wehrmacht rolled through France in 1940, he was managing accounts. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941 and 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border, in the largest invasion in human history, Vasily Zaytsev was still shuffling papers. It drove him mad. The accounts coming from the front were catastrophic. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. Soviet forces were being encircled and destroyed in enormous battles of annihilation. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were being killed or captured. Cities were falling. The Wehrmacht was advancing deeper into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. Vasily submitted his first request for transfer to a frontline unit. It was denied. He submitted a second request, denied again. He kept trying. 5 times he formally requested assignment to combat duty. 5 times his superiors refused, valuing his clerical skills more than his desire to fight. But by summer 1942, the situation had become desperate enough that the Soviet military could no longer afford to be selective. They needed every soldier who could hold a rifle. Vasily's transfer was finally approved. His destination was a city that would become synonymous with the absolute worst that modern warfare could inflict on human beings. A city where the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier was measured in hours, not days. A city that would be almost completely destroyed in fighting so intense that it would claim over 2 million casualties. The city was Stalingrad, and what waited there would transform a clerk from Vladivostok into a legend. September 1942. Vasily Zaytsev crossed the Volga River at night, packed onto a boat with other reinforcements being rushed into the city. German artillery pounded the river constantly, turning the crossing into a deadly gamble. Boats sank regularly, taking their human cargo to the bottom. The soldiers who made it across emerged onto the western bank to find something beyond comprehension. Stalingrad had ceased to exist as a city. What remained was a landscape of destruction so complete it defied description. The Luftwaffe had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Buildings that once housed families now stood as burned-out husks, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shell impacts. The streets had disappeared under debris. Bodies lay everywhere, German and Soviet, frozen in the positions where death had found them. The battle wasn't being fought along traditional front lines. There were no secure rear areas, no safe positions. The Germans controlled some buildings. The Soviets held others, sometimes with only a wall separating them. Combat happened at ranges measured in meters, not kilometers. Soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes for days over a single apartment building. Vasily was assigned to the 1047th Rifle Regiment of the 284th Rifle Division, which formed part of the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov. His unit was given a sector near the factories in the northern part of the city, where Soviet workers had continued manufacturing tanks, even as German shells fell around them, driving their products straight from the assembly line into combat. The regiment needed every rifle it could get. German forces were trying to push the defenders into the Volga, to capture the city that bore Stalin's name, and deliver a devastating blow to Soviet morale. The fighting was beyond brutal. Soldiers developed a dark joke. To survive in Stalingrad, you needed 3 things: a rifle, ammunition, and the absolute certainty you wouldn't live long enough to use all the ammunition. But Vasily Zaytsev had something most of his comrades lacked. Years of hunting in the Urals had given him skills that translated perfectly to urban combat. While other soldiers struggled to identify targets in the ruins, Vasily saw patterns. While others rushed into position and got killed, Vasily moved with the patience of a man who'd spent days tracking deer through forests. While others fired wildly and wasted ammunition, Vasily made every shot count. His first rifle was a standard-issue Mosin Nagant M 1891, a 5-shot bolt-action weapon that had been the backbone of Russian infantry for half a century. No telescopic sight, just iron sights. The same kind of basic equipment he'd used hunting in the mountains. On his 3rd day in Stalingrad, Vasily spotted a German officer at a distance he estimated at over 800 meters. At that range, most soldiers wouldn't even attempt a shot with iron sights. The officer was directing soldiers, gesturing, completely unaware he'd been seen. Vasily settled into position, controlled his breathing exactly as his grandfather had taught him, compensated for wind and bullet drop, and fired. The officer collapsed. Two subordinates rushed to help him. Vasily had already worked the bolt, chambering another round. He shot the first helper, worked the bolt again, shot the second. 3 Germans dead in less than 10 seconds, all at a range where iron sights were supposedly ineffective. His platoon commander witnessed the shots. Word spread quickly through the regiment. The new clerk from Vladivostok could actually shoot. Over the next 10 days, Vasily killed 40 German soldiers. 40 confirmed kills in less than 2 weeks, all while the battle raged around him at an intensity that broke men's minds. The division commander heard about the clerk with the rifle and made a decision that would change the course of the battle. Vasily was awarded the Medal for Bravery and officially designated a sniper. He received a Mosin Nagin equipped with a PU scope, a simple 4-power telescopic sight that would become his most valued possession. The rifle would stay with him through the entire war, and eventually end up in a museum where visitors could see the weapon that had killed hundreds of German soldiers. But receiving the designation and the rifle was just the beginning. What came next would make Vasily Zaytsev famous throughout the Soviet Union, would terrify German soldiers, and would eventually lead to a confrontation that would become one of the most famous sniper duels in history. Though whether that duel actually happened the way it was told is something historians still debate. October 1942. The battle for Stalingrad ground on with unrelenting violence. Every building, every street, every pile of rubble became a battlefield. German forces pushed forward meter by meter, taking horrific casualties but continuing to advance. Soviet defenders held positions until they were overrun, then counterattacked to retake them. The city had become a meat grinder, consuming lives at an unprecedented rate. In this environment, snipers thrived. The rubble provided countless hiding positions. The destroyed buildings offered excellent fields of fire. The close-quarters nature of the fighting meant targets were abundant. Both sides deployed trained marksmen, and the psychological impact was devastating. Ordinary soldiers became paranoid, afraid to move, knowing that a single moment of carelessness could result in a bullet from an invisible enemy. Vasily Zaytsev operated with methodical precision. He studied German patterns, learning how their soldiers moved, where they felt safe, what mistakes they made repeatedly. He identified the best positions, places where he could observe large areas while remaining nearly impossible to spot. He never stayed in one location too long, rotating between multiple firing positions to prevent enemy snipers from tracking him. His partner was Nikolai Kulikov, an experienced soldier who served as his spotter. The two developed an almost telepathic understanding. Kulikov would observe the battlefield through binoculars, identifying targets and watching for enemy snipers. Vasily would remain absolutely still, rifle ready, waiting for the perfect moment to fire. After each shot, they would change position, never giving the Germans time to locate them. The partnership was devastatingly effective. Together, they refined techniques that would later be codified in Soviet sniper doctrine. One tactic they perfected was called the sixes. 3 pairs of snipers, each consisting of a shooter and spotter, would position themselves to cover the same area from different angles. This created overlapping fields of fire that made it nearly impossible for enemy soldiers to move safely, and made it extremely difficult for enemy snipers to locate the Soviet positions, since shots could come from multiple locations. Vasily also developed a personal hunting philosophy that he would later teach to other snipers. He described the unique psychological aspect of his work. You could watch a German officer emerge from a bunker, acting with complete authority, ordering soldiers around, behaving as if he owned the battlefield. The officer had no idea he had seconds to live. There was something almost intimate about it, watching a man who didn't know he was already dead. The kills mounted rapidly. By late October, Vasily had exceeded 100 confirmed kills. The Soviet propaganda machine recognized the value of his story. Here was a simple man from the depths of Russia, a former clerk, who was single-handedly terrorizing the invaders. Journalists were sent to interview him. His photograph appeared in Soviet newspapers. Radio broadcasts mentioned him by name. He became a symbol of Soviet resistance, proof that the German war machine could be defeated. The Germans noticed. Intelligence officers compiled reports about Soviet sniper activity in the Stalingrad sector. Casualties from sniper fire were increasing. German soldiers were becoming afraid to move during daylight. Morale was suffering. Someone needed to address the problem. According to Soviet accounts, the Germans responded by sending their best. The head of a sniper school, an expert marksman with years of training and experience, a man whose specific mission was to hunt down Vasily Zaytsev and eliminate the threat he represented. The Soviet sources called him Major Erwin König. They described him as a master sniper from Berlin, equipped with a rifle fitted with a 10-power scope, far superior to the 4-power optics used by most snipers. He arrived in Stalingrad with orders to restore German confidence by killing the sniper who had become a Soviet hero. What happened next became one of the most famous stories of World War II, a duel between two expert marksmen hunting each other through the ruins. A game of patience, deception, and nerve that lasted several days and would end with only one survivor. The problem is that historians have found significant issues with this account. No German records mention an officer named Erwin König. The Wehrmacht, notorious for its obsessive documentation, has no mention of a sniper school director being sent to Stalingrad on a special mission. There's no record of a Major König dying in the city. No family came forward after the war to identify him. No fellow soldiers confirmed his existence. British historian Frank Ellis examined the story extensively and concluded it was likely Soviet propaganda. The Germans had no sniper school in Berlin in 1942. The account contains inconsistencies, including the direction of sunlight during the alleged final shot that doesn't match the geography of the German and Soviet positions. Yet Vasily Zaytsev insisted the duel happened. He described it in his memoirs, though notably he didn't provide a specific date for when König was killed, despite usually being precise about dates in his accounts. He told the story to Soviet journalist Vasily Grossman, who included it in articles that spread throughout the Soviet Union. So what actually happened? The most likely explanation is that Vasily did hunt and kill a German sniper during this period. Of his 225 confirmed kills at Stalingrad, 11 were identified as enemy snipers. One of them was probably more skilled than the others, possibly someone with formal training. The hunt for this particular enemy would have been more challenging, more dangerous, requiring multiple days of patience and careful observation. Soviet propagandists, recognizing the story's value, transformed a difficult but successful hunt into an epic duel between titans. They gave the German sniper a name, a rank, a prestigious position. They added details that made the story more dramatic. They created a narrative that gave Soviet citizens a hero to rally around during the darkest period of the war. Whether the duel happened exactly as described doesn't diminish what Vasily actually accomplished. The confirmed facts are remarkable enough. Between October and December 1942, he killed 225 German soldiers in just over 2 months. That's more than 3 kills per day, sustained over weeks of combat in the most intense urban warfare the world had ever seen. He trained dozens of other Soviet snipers who would go on to kill thousands more Germans. He developed tactics that remained in use decades later, and he survived in an environment where survival seemed impossible, but his war wasn't over. The worst was still to come. January 1943. The battle for Stalingrad reached its final phase. German forces, surrounded and cut off, were slowly being destroyed. Soviet reinforcements poured across the Volga. The grinding, claustrophobic fighting continued, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Vasily's sniper group had grown to 13 men, all trained in his methods. They operated as a cohesive unit, using the sixes tactic to dominate entire sectors of the battlefield. German soldiers knew better than to expose themselves in areas where Zaytsev's group operated. The division commander gave them a critical mission. A German attack was being prepared against the right flank of a Soviet regiment. Vasily's group of 13 snipers had to disrupt the assault, kill key officers, create enough chaos to blunt the offensive. The mission succeeded. German officers fell to precisely aimed shots before they could properly organize their troops. The attack faltered, broke apart, failed to achieve its objectives. But in the confusion of the battle, Vasily made a decision that violated his own principles. He broke cover and led his men in an open assault against German infantry positions. It was the opposite of everything he taught, everything he practiced. Snipers were supposed to be invisible, patient, disciplined. They weren't supposed to charge enemy positions like regular infantry. But in that moment, caught up in the heat of combat, watching his men fight desperately against a German counterattack, something in him snapped. The hunter became just another soldier rushing forward with his weapon. The Germans responded with artillery. Mortars and shells rained down on the Soviet position. The explosions were everywhere, throwing up frozen earth, metal fragments, and shattered concrete. One detonated close enough to Vasily that the concussive blast lifted him off his feet and slammed him into the ground. The world disappeared into white light and deafening noise. When consciousness returned, he realized immediately something was catastrophically wrong. He couldn't see, nothing, complete darkness. His hands moved to his face, feeling wetness that he knew was blood. The pain came then, sharp and overwhelming. Shrapnel had struck his eyes, the most valuable asset a sniper possessed. His comrades pulled him to cover, called for medical assistance. The evacuation from Stalingrad was chaotic, dangerous. Getting wounded men across the Volga River while under German artillery fire was a deadly gamble. Many died during the crossing. Vasily made it, unconscious for much of the journey, his face wrapped in bandages that quickly soaked through with blood. The field hospitals behind the lines were overwhelmed. Thousands of wounded soldiers filled every available space. The medical staff worked around the clock, performing triage, trying to save those who could be saved. Vasily's case was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Soldiers with chest wounds, with severed limbs, with abdominal injuries took priority. He waited in darkness, unable to see, uncertain if he ever would again. When surgeons finally examined him, their assessment was cautious. The shrapnel had damaged both eyes severely. Fragments remained embedded in the tissue. The operations required would be delicate, painful, and offered no guarantee of success. Even if they could remove the shrapnel, even if they could repair the physical damage, there was no certainty his vision would return. Vasily was evacuated further east, to hospitals with better equipment and more experienced surgeons. The journey took days, traveling by truck and train through the Soviet rear areas. Each movement brought fresh agony. The bandages had to be changed regularly, a process that left him gasping from pain. Infection was a constant risk. Antibiotics were scarce, reserved for the most critical cases. The first surgery lasted hours. Vasily was awake for part of it, the anesthesia inadequate. He felt the instruments working on his face, felt the surgeons extracting metal fragments from tissue that shouldn't be touched. He forced himself to remain still, knowing that any movement could make things worse. The hunter's patience, the sniper's discipline, served him even on the operating table. Recovery was agonizing. The pain was constant, sharp, and burning. But worse than the physical suffering was the psychological torment. His entire identity had been built around his eyes, his ability to see what others missed, to identify targets at distances where most men saw nothing. What was he without that? Who was Vasily Zaytsev if he couldn't shoot? Days blurred together in the darkness. He heard other patients in the ward, heard their groans, their cries, their conversations. Some were recovering. Others were dying. The nurses would speak to him kindly, tell him he was doing well, that he needed to be patient, but he could hear the uncertainty in their voices. Weeks passed. More surgeries, more pain, more waiting in the darkness. The doctors told him the physical damage was healing, but they couldn't predict when or if his vision would return. Nerve damage was unpredictable. Eyes were complicated. He needed to prepare for the possibility that the blindness might be permanent. In those dark weeks, Vasily had time to think about everything he'd seen in Stalingrad. The faces of the men he'd killed, the friends he'd lost, the city that had been destroyed around him, the war that continued without him. He wondered if his sniping career was over, if his contribution to the war had ended in one moment of abandoning the caution that had kept him alive. Then, on February 10th, 1943, 1 month after the injury, something changed. A faint sensation of light penetrating the darkness. Not clear vision. Not yet, but something, he told the doctors. They unwrapped the bandages carefully, shined lights into his eyes, examined him with cautious optimism. Vasily opened his eyes and saw light. Blurry, indistinct, but light. Shapes began to emerge from the blur. Faces. The room around him. His vision was returning. The improvement continued over the following days. The blur sharpened gradually. Colors became distinguishable. Details emerged. The surgeons had succeeded. Against odds that weren't favorable, they'd restored his sight. It wasn't perfect, would never be exactly what it had been, but it was functional. He could see. By the time his vision had returned enough for him to read, to recognize faces clearly, to function normally, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. On February 2nd, German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army. Over 90,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Most would never return home, dying in the prison camps from disease, malnutrition, and the brutal conditions. The tide of the war had turned. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a successful strategic offensive in the Soviet Union. Vasily learned about the victory from his hospital bed. The city he'd defended so desperately, where he'd killed hundreds of Germans, where he'd nearly lost his life multiple times, had held. The sacrifice had meant something. The stand at Stalingrad had broken the back of the German offensive, had proven that the Wehrmacht wasn't invincible, had given the Soviet Union time to mobilize its vast resources for the counteroffensive that would eventually push all the way to Berlin. Vasily Zaytsev could have accepted a rear echelon position. He'd done more than enough. He was a hero of the Soviet Union, awarded the nation's highest honor. He'd become famous throughout the country. His injuries would have justified a comfortable assignment training snipers at a school far from the front, spending the rest of the war in relative safety, teaching others what he'd learned in the ruins. He chose to return to combat. The war wasn't over. Germany was still fighting. His country still needed him, and perhaps more than anything, he needed to prove to himself that the injury hadn't broken him, that he was still the hunter from the Urals who'd terrorized the Germans at Stalingrad. The doctors cleared him for duty in late spring 1943. He was given time to recover his strength, to adjust to the slight changes in his vision, to ensure he could still perform effectively. When he finally returned to his unit, his reputation preceded him. The sniper who'd been blinded and returned. The man who wouldn't quit. Vasily Zaytsev was going back to war. Vasily rejoined the war with the rank of captain. He participated in the Soviet offensives that pushed the Germans back across Ukraine, through the Donbass region, across the Dnieper River, liberating Odessa. The nature of the fighting had changed. No longer the desperate defense of Stalingrad, but mobile warfare across vast distances. He served as a company commander, leading infantry units rather than operating as a sniper. His combat experience and tactical knowledge made him valuable in this role, but it was a far cry from the solitary hunting that had made him famous. The war had entered its final phase. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was being crushed between Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied forces pushing from the west. In April 1945, Vasily participated in the Battle of the Silo Heights, one of the last major battles in Europe. German forces had fortified a ridge of hills east of Berlin, creating a defensive position meant to protect the capital. Soviet forces attacked with overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. The Germans fought desperately, knowing defeat meant the end of the war. The battle lasted 3 days and cost both sides enormous casualties, but the Germans couldn't hold. The Silo Heights fell. Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin. Vasily Zaytsev's war ended not in the ruins of Stalingrad, where he'd become famous, but on German soil, watching the Reich collapse. He survived. That simple fact was extraordinary. Most of the men who'd crossed the Volga with him in September 1942 had died in Stalingrad. Most of the snipers he'd trained had been killed. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad had been less than 24 hours. Vasily had spent months there, operating in the most exposed and dangerous role possible, and lived. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Vasily returned to civilian life. He settled in Kiev, studied at a textile university, and eventually became the director of a factory. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about the war, about Stalingrad, about the men he'd killed. The fame that had been thrust upon him during the battle was something he seemed to prefer leaving in the past. But the Soviet Union hadn't forgotten him. He remained a symbol of the Great Patriotic War, a reminder of when the nation had stood on the brink of destruction and fought back. His memoir was published, translated into multiple languages. Films and books featured him. His rifle was displayed in the Volgograd Museum of Defense. The city's new name after Stalingrad had been renamed. Vasily Zaytsev died on December 15, 1991, at the age of 76. 11 days later, the Soviet Union dissolved. The country he defended had ceased to exist. He was initially buried in Kiev, but that wasn't where he wanted to rest. He'd stated clearly that he wished to be buried in Stalingrad, the city he'd defended. In 2006, his wish was finally granted. His remains were reburied with full military honors at Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic height that had been one of the most contested positions during the battle. A memorial complex now stands there, dedicated to the defenders of Stalingrad. Vasily Zaytsev lies among the soldiers he fought beside, overlooking the city where he became a legend. The techniques Vasily developed in the ruins of Stalingrad continue to influence military doctrine. The Sixes tactic is still taught to Russian snipers. The emphasis on patience, observation, and constant position changes remains fundamental to sniper training. His success demonstrated that a well-trained marksman could have an impact on a battle far beyond what their individual kill count might suggest. The psychological effect of sniper fire on enemy morale, the way it restricted enemy movement and forced them to be constantly vigilant, proved as valuable as the casualties inflicted. Vasily returned to Kiev in 1945 and enrolled in the All-Union Institute of Textile and Light Industry. He graduated and worked as an engineer, eventually becoming director of a garment factory and heading a technical school. He married a woman named Maria and built a quiet life, rarely speaking about Stalingrad, even with family. The memories were too painful, too personal, but the Soviet government never forgot him. He remained a symbol of the Great Patriotic War, called upon for ceremonial duties and military consultations. During the 1960s, he participated in testing the SVD rifle, the new semi-automatic sniper weapon that would become standard issue for Soviet forces and serve in dozens of countries worldwide. His manual on sniper tactics became required reading in Soviet military academies. The principles were simple but profound. A sniper's first duty is survival because a dead sniper helps no one. Never take a shot unless you're certain of success. Quality matters more than quantity. These concepts spread beyond the Soviet Union, influencing sniper training programs in militaries around the world. In 1969, a monument was erected at Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic height overlooking Stalingrad. The centerpiece was a massive statue called the Motherland Calls, standing 85 meters tall. At the base were walls inscribed with over 35,000 names of defenders who had died in the battle. Vasily visited whenever his health permitted, walking among the names of men he'd fought beside. Vasily Zaytsev died on December 15, 1991, at the age of 76. 11 days later, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. He'd lived just long enough to see the end of the nation he'd helped save. He was initially buried in Kiev, but he'd been clear about his wishes. He wanted to rest in Stalingrad, among the soldiers who died there. In 2006, 15 years after his death, his remains were exhumed and transported to Volgograd. On January 31st, the anniversary of the German surrender at Stalingrad, Vasily was reburied with full military honors at Mamayev Kurgan. A rifle salute echoed across the memorial complex. Veterans stood at attention. Vasily had finally come home. His story has been told and retold, sometimes accurately, sometimes with embellishments that make it difficult to separate fact from propaganda. The duel with Major Koenig, whether it happened as described or not, became part of popular culture. The 2001 film Enemy at the Gates introduced him to audiences who'd never heard of Stalingrad. Video games have featured characters based on him. His name remains synonymous with sniper warfare. Military training facilities around the world reference his tactics. The emphasis on two-person teams, position rotation, and the psychological dimension of sniper operations weren't obvious concepts in 1942. Vasily and his fellow Soviet snipers developed them through trial and error. Modern sniper doctrine in armies, from the U.S. Marines to the Israeli Defense Forces, owes debts to methods he pioneered. But beyond the legend, beyond the propaganda, beyond the Hollywood dramatizations, the core truth remains. A man from the Ural Mountains, taught to hunt by his grandfather, transformed those skills into one of the most effective combat records of World War II. He defended his country during its darkest hour. He trained others to do the same. He survived when survival seemed impossible. The farm boy from Yeleninskoye had taken down not just individual snipers, but had helped break the back of the German offensive at Stalingrad. His contribution to that victory, and to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany, came not from sophisticated equipment or formal military training, but from lessons learned tracking wolves through frozen forests, patience, discipline, the ability to remain absolutely still, the nerve to take a single shot and make it count. Those skills, passed down from grandfather to grandson in one of the most remote regions of Russia, proved sufficient to change history. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.